So alhamdulillah, it was such an honor to be with you last night and to hear from community members who are hurting, who are struggling, to see how as a community you come together with that intention of being there for one another. And I think that's one of the most critical components in how we try to rebuild and how we try to work together to heal. Because again, if you take nothing from this weekend, please take this, that you are not alone, that there are people out there that Allah Azza wa Jal has placed in your path that are meant to help you, that we are all going to be tested and we're going to go through our tests in different ways, at different times, through different experiences, but we're not meant to go through them alone. So inshallah, my hope is that at the end of this programming that the masjid has put together, there is a sense of community, a greater sense of connection, and a recognition that you're not alone. I know a few people had asked me yesterday that, okay, well, who do I call if I need help? Where do I go? Where do I turn to? And I know it can be hard to navigate kind of our systems and, what is the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist and a therapist and an interventionist. We do try at our organization, Cornerstone, to provide these different resources, to provide explanations. We have our cards for our organization up there, Cornerstone. You can reach out to me as well. And I'm not gonna advertise my phone number, but if somebody wants it, please, you can come up and ask me. I did give it to a few people yesterday as well. So you're welcome to come up and ask me for that as well. If there's something that you need to text me about, you're always welcome to do that, inshallah. And as I said, our office is very responsive. We have a policy of responding to every question, whether emailed, texted, or sent to us in any way within 24 hours. So inshallah, reach out, and as much as possible, we will try to help in any way that we can. All right, bismillah. So I love the topic that was selected for this workshop, the idea of building a thriving community. And how do we build that thriving community? Not just a thriving individual, not just a person who is thriving, but an entire community that is thriving. How do we build that thriving community on the element of resilience, on that sense of being able to feel like we're working together, that we are truly, becoming the best versions of ourselves, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, socially, in every way possibly, as well as mentally, of course. My field of study, my research focuses on emotional resilience, and I spent 7 years in terms of my dissertation researching what makes someone resilient. Why is it that one person can be tested with the most difficult of tests, something that as human beings we wonder how they could withstand the pain of that loss, of that grief, of that difficulty, how someone can be tested with such difficulty and still continue to move forward, continue to say alhamdulillah, and how someone else may be tested with circumstances that we look at and we think, wait, why is this so difficult? Why is this person struggling? And yet they may crumble and they may not be able to move forward. And so my research took me to the refugee camps, and I spent a great deal of time in the camps in Jordan, on the border of Syria, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in many other locations as well. And in these refugee camps, I began collecting oral histories. And oral histories they're considered an art form in which you simply allow people to tell their stories. And as they share their stories, I was looking for what is the clue? What is it that allows some people to move forward and continue to thrive and some people to struggle? And what consistently came up in the research that was done was that there are 3 elements that connect people and that allow them to experience the greatest emotional resilience. And those 3 elements are community, faith, and hope. And all 3 of those elements are tied together. So when we look at the element of faith, our iman, we know that our deen is very closely tied to maintaining that hope, to truly seeing in Allah that which is best, to recognize that Allah is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, He is the most merciful, the most compassionate, and that He will see us through any difficulty that we face. That's hope. And it's tied to faith, because the stronger we are in terms of our connection to Allah, the greater our hope and the stronger we are able to apply our faith to the difficulties and the tragedies that we may face. But that other component of community is also critical, because community isn't always built on family. Community isn't always built on our immediate surroundings. Sometimes we find our communities online. Sometimes we find our communities in our masajid. Sometimes we find them in our schools. But it is important that we have that sense of community. And I remember one of the stories that really impacted me, as I was doing my research, was a young girl. Her name was Salam. And Salam was 15 years old. And so at that time, I remember my daughter was about 15. So I went up to Salam, in the refugee camp. This was in Al-Mafraq in Jordan. And I went up to her and I said, "Oh, Salam, you're 15. That's the same age as my daughter. What do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do?" And she kind of looked at me and she had this look on her face like, "Wait, what are you talking about?" And she responded and she said, "Well, I'm getting married." And I'm like, "Yeah, inshallah, in the future you're going to get married." And she said, No, I'm getting married next week." And I was like, "No, wait, why are you getting married next week? You're 15. And she said, "It's the least that I can do to help my family." And I said, No, there's other ways that we can help your family. We're going to find funding. We're going to find a sponsor." And she kind of just shook her head in a way where she was just like, "But alhamdulillah, I'm getting married." And so she talked to me about what her family had been through. And she said that she was living in Idlib with her father, her mother, and her 6 siblings. And the town of Idlib was bombed. And she said her father was killed in that bombing. And she said, her mother and her siblings were able to escape. And they got to the border of Jordan, and they were actually able to enter the Za'atari camp. And she said it was the scariest journey, the most difficult journey in order to get to that point, but we made it. And she said once we got into the Za'atari camp, and for those of you who are familiar with the refugee camps, we know that Za'atari camp is unfortunately one of the most overrun and inadequate camps for the number of people that are in there now, similar to the Cox's Bazar camps in Rohingya. But she said we were in this camp and my youngest sibling became very, very ill. He was a baby. And she said we knew we needed to leave the camp to get into Jordan to try to get some kind of health care for him. And she said to leave the camp, it's similar to trying to get out of the country of crisis, the country of origin, because these camps are often ruled by something similar to a mafia, where the earlier people who have resettled in these camps wind up border patrolling the borders, and they won't allow anyone to leave without a bribe, because of course refugees are meant not to leave the camps that they're in. Most countries won't welcome them into the actual borders of the country. So she said it was again, the darkest part of night, and again we made our way through the camp and we got to the border. And she said when we got to the border, we were stopped by the border patrol, and they told my mother, either you turn back with your children or you leave us your oldest daughter. And she said my sister was just 16 at that time. And she said my mom left her because she had to save the rest of us. And she said we were able to leave, and Salam was the next child in line. And she said, Alhamdulillah, we were able to leave. And now I'm going to get married because this will help my family. And she didn't have any tears. There were no cracks in her voice. There was absolute acceptance. And this is one of hundreds and hundreds of stories that were told to me at these camps. And every time I would hear these stories, I couldn't help but think, subhanallah, how are you still standing? How are you still moving forward? What is it that continues to keep you going? And what we often see with the refugees that we serve in our refugee division at Cornerstone is that during the pre-flight trauma, when those who we serve are living in the country of crisis, are struggling, they go into survival mode. And so they're functioning, they're just moving forward. And they don't allow the emotions to be unpacked. When they go through the flight trauma period, the period of leaving the country of crisis in order to enter a place of safety, they are again in survival mode. They're not allowing their feelings to unload or unpack because they just have to make it to safety. It's their physiological elements that are kicking in I need a safe place to stay, I need food in my body, I need water. And so the emotions are never unpacked. It's not until they are in post-flight mode, where they are resettled, where they are in a country that is meant to be physiologically safe, that often the trauma is unpacked. And so we'll see the trauma unpacked in ways that may not be exhibited in what we might normally classify as an exhibition of sadness or an exhibition of grief or an exhibition of sorrow or loss. So we'll see clients who respond in anger and being very upset because, the color of the couch that's in their apartment is not the color they wanted. And it's not because they are angry. It's not because in that moment they are feeling an overflow of the emotion of anger. It's because the trauma has not been released, and so it's released in other ways. And we use this understanding in addressing issues of anger management in our own communities even. We use this understanding in recognizing that so often our emotions are masked because we're carrying trauma with us and we can't unpack that trauma in a healthy way. And so our emotions come out in ways that may harm ourselves or harm others. And this is all to say, oops, did we disconnect the slides? Something happened. There we go, alhamdulillah, okay. This is all to say, when we try to unpack and understand mental health and mental wellness, it's not a linear. It's not point A to point B, and that's it. We know exactly how things happen. We understand why someone experiences depression and why someone doesn't, why someone experiences anxiety, why someone doesn't. It's not a straight line. There are so many components that go into the impact of mental health and mental wellness, and so many components, factors internally and externally that can affect the elements of resilience and how we respond to the mental health challenges that we may face. But before we take a deeper dive, I think it's important to just understand how prevalent mental health struggles really are in our communities, and most of the facts that I have here, this chart is actually from NAMI, which addresses pretty much children and teens throughout America. But most of the statistics that we see here are relatively close within the Muslim American community as well. Again, we sometimes bury our head in the sand and we think, well, not Muslims, Muslims are not affected in this way. I know one of the sisters was telling me that you have Dr. Rania Awad coming, inshallah, in February. And this is, she's from the Islamic Psychology Lab in Stanford. And this is her space of research and her field of research. And you will see the research that she has conducted that indicates how the numbers of mental health statistics for the American community at large are very closely tied to the statistics we see within the Muslim American community as well. So we see here, according to NAMI, that 1 in 5 children ages 13 to 18 have or will have a serious mental illness. 20% of youth ages 13 to 18 currently live with a mental health condition. 11% of youth have some form of mood disorder. 10% of youth have a behavior or conduct disorder. 8% of youth have an anxiety disorder. 50% of lifetime cases of mental illness begin by age 14 and 75% by age 24. The average delay between the onset of symptoms and intervention is 8 to 10 years. And there's other statistics here, and I can share them with you separately, but I think it's critical to understand, many times I will have parents or families that will tell me, she was totally fine until she hit age 14 or 15, or he was perfectly normal until he was 14, 15, 16. These different stages, these different ages are not necessarily indicative of a traumatic incident that occurs at that stage. Many times the difficulty and the strenuous emotions that the person is experiencing that winds up potentially turning into a mental health struggle have been developing over years. And so it's compounded and it builds until it reaches that point where we begin to see the actual manifestation of those symptoms. but those symptoms are often there beneath the surface and being carried. Remember what we talked about with the refugee clients, survival mode. So often, especially with children, it's about survival mode because they don't know how to process what they're feeling. They don't know how to put words to what's happening inside of them. And as they grow older, there may be triggers that do impact the trauma, or they begin to feel a sense of physiological safety, and then the mind begins to unpack the emotion. Currently, we see that suicide is the third leading cause of death in youth ages 10 to 24. And this does apply to our Muslim communities as well. And so we want to be aware and recognize the impact of mental health and the challenges that we face, but also what we can do about it, how we can address it. We talked about this ayah yesterday, and I highlight it again today because I think it's so critical for us to know that same, line that I want you to take away from this weekend, that we're not alone. That even in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal tells us that we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger and a loss of wealth and lives. So we know that these tests are written for us, that we will experience these tests. And the first test that Allah Azza wa Jal mentions in this verse is one of fear. What is fear? Fear often manifests as anxiety. Fear often manifests as potentially something that could grow into depression. Fear often manifests as paranoia. Fear often manifests as OCD behaviors, where our mind is so fearful of what is to come, of what we're experiencing, of our surroundings, that it enters into this place of disarray almost in terms of functionality. Allah Azza wa Jal knows. He knows that He will test us with these tests. And so we have to stop being in denial and think that there's something wrong with the person who experiences anxiety, that there's something wrong with the family in which depression is prevalent, that there's something wrong with the community in which there are mental health struggles, because it's part of our tests in this dunya. So at Cornerstone, our approach is using a lens of spiritual, psycho-socio-emotional, relational wellness. And I know that's a mouthful, but essentially what it means is taking a holistic look at mental health. So often today in secular approaches to mental health, the focus is all here. What's happening in the mind? How is the mind processing the past? How is the mind responding to triggers? But we know that we are not just the sum of what's up here, that it is our mind, it is our heart, it is our soul, it is our environment, it is our family, it is so many other factors that impact our responses and our processing of what it is that our sensory elements tend to pick up. So when we take a secular approach to mental wellness, we do ourselves a disfavor because we're eliminating and losing sight of all of the other elements. But when we take an approach that is purely physical, for example, exercise more, eat 3 meals a day, sleep, we're also doing a disfavor for the person who is struggling. When we take a purely spiritual approach, when we say, well, if you pray more, if you strengthen your iman, again, we're losing sight, we're missing the holistic elements of recognizing all of these aspects go hand in hand. And until we start approaching mental wellness as a holistic aspect, something that is impacted, again, by the internal and the external, until we start taking this wider lens, we're going to keep getting stuck in that cycle of treating this and losing sight of everything else that impacts what's happening here. Because our thoughts are not isolated. Our thoughts don't necessarily come just from one place. Our thoughts are formed from our past, from our present, from our fears of the future. Our thoughts are formed from the people that surround us, from our community, from the state of our faith. And so all of these thoughts can impact the outcome of how our mind and our body responds. So how are our thoughts formed? Many of you know that, I think in the past when I've come here to ICGC, my topic that I tend to focus on is parenting and family. And for me personally, this is a space that I feel very strongly about, because as much as we know the individual is impacted by individual elements, The individual is also impacted by family or the lack thereof, by connections or the lack thereof. The individual is also impacted by how they've been parented. What did they grow up with? What childhood stressors have they faced? The individual is impacted by friends, by community, by schools, by what it is that has been input into the mind, into the body, into the soul as they've been growing up. So some of the childhood stressors that may impact the thought processes and how we think about ourselves, it can come from a critical component, from elements where parents or teachers or friends are constantly criticizing. It can come from feeling that you're not seen, you're not heard, you're not understood. It can come from feeling like you're the odd one out, like you're not connecting, you feel like there's this distance. And these childhood stressors can grow and grow and grow inside the mind until it does lead to self-doubt, lack of self-esteem, lack of self-valuation, and it can also, of course, result in outcomes of anxiety, of depression, and other mental health outcomes. You know, I always think it's a very powerful image, because so often in our Muslim communities in particular, I tend to see the form of communication between parent and child to be one of criticism. And so many times we think we're motivating our children. You know, the child who gets the A-, and we tell them, why didn't you get the A+? The child who, you know, dresses a certain way, the child who looks a certain way, the child who eats a certain way, the child who talks a certain way. And every time what we see parents responding with is rather than a love, an acceptance, an embracing. Instead, we see our children so often having the responses from their own family of criticism, of harsh words, of put-downs. And that can be just as harmful as the physical harm that we had talked about yesterday. And it's something that unfortunately we see in our communities, we see in our families, and it's very much negatively impacting the perspectives of how people see themselves and how they respond to the world around them. And so this would be our step one, countering the negativity. Think about yourself, think about your home, think about your family. How do you speak to your children? How are you spoken to? How does your spouse interact with you? How do your parents interact with you? How do you communicate with others? What is the voice in your head? Is it a voice of authenticity that feels like it's truly your own, that you have developed over time? Or is it the voice of an overly critical parent? Is it the voice of a teacher who has put you down? Is it the voice of a friends or people in school who have said negative things? What is the voice internally that responds to you, that responds to your innermost thoughts? What does it sound like? Who does it sound like? If it doesn't sound like you, if it's not a voice that is encouraging, a voice that is motivating, a voice that is reminding you to be the best version of yourself and recognizing that you can be the best version of yourself, then that's a voice that needs to be revamped. It's a voice that needs to be revisited. And it's very, very hard to do that alone. And this is where people will often say, I don't need a counselor, I don't need a therapist. And my response is always, yes, yes you do, we all do. Because it's so hard to tease out that voice without having the help of someone who is outside of ourselves, guiding us through a better understanding of how we've become who we are, how we've gotten to this place in our life, why we respond in the way that we do, and understanding what that means and what that looks like. We also know that we live in a society that loves to point fingers, you know, whether online, our children or we are facing issues of, you know, body image, issues of, you know, low self-esteem and low self-valuation, you know, for our young women, hijab and the response to hijab, discrimination, exclusion for our young men, not knowing. There was a question yesterday that led us a little bit into that toxic masculinity discussion. How do our boys grow up to be men? How do they carry the mantle of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam in their interactions? And unfortunately, we have a society that keeps pushing and pulling in opposite directions. So these are all difficulties that we're seeing, and countering those difficulties with that positive narrative, but also validating and understanding that these difficulties exist. Every time we tell our children, every time we tell our friends, every time we tell our community members, get over it. Why are you so upset? Think about the children in Gaza. Think about what's happening in Sudan. You should say Alhamdulillah. This is not encouragement. This is not motivation. This is a lack of validation. Instead of understanding and recognizing and saying what you're going through is really hard right now, instead of reminding each other of the verse in the Quran, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها, that Allah Azza wa Jal will not burden a soul with anything greater than that soul can bear. Instead of telling one another, our children, our spouses, our friends, our community member, ourselves, that this is hard, this is difficult. And yes, my test may not be a test of living in a war zone. My test may not be a loss of a family member. My test may not be starvation. My test may not be crisis like the crises that I see around me. But my test, even if it's a test of sadness, a test of not connecting, a test of loneliness, a test of not having friends, it is a test, just like the other tests that people experience. And it is a valid emotion to feel that heaviness, to feel that sadness. But once we validate it, then we ask ourselves, we ask our friends, we ask our children, we ask our spouse, what can we do about it? How can we address it? The emotion is valid. The heaviness is valid, and just because it looks different for each person and it comes in response differently to each different situation, it doesn't mean that it's any less valid. So learning how to talk about it, learning how to unpack those emotions, learning how to normalize these conversations is so critical. Anxiety is one of the outward elements that we tend to see, inward and outward. Many times people who are experiencing anxiety may actually look unruffled. But just like the anxiety duck in the image that we have here, externally they may seem fine on the surface, but internally they may be struggling. So someone who has social anxiety, maybe they want to come to the masjid, maybe they wanted to come to this event even, but maybe the thought of being out in the community was really difficult. Maybe the idea of what are they going to say, what if someone laughs at me, what if someone looks at me, what if someone comments about me? Maybe those are the thoughts that are running through their mind. We talked a little bit yesterday, there was a question about how do you bring someone to the masjid if they're refusing to come? How do you bring them to the community if they keep rejecting the community? And sometimes it's not about bringing them, sometimes it's about going there to them, meeting them where they're at. Meaning, look around. If there is someone that you know should be here but isn't here, reach out to them during the break. Send them a text message. Say, hey, I really would have loved to see you here. I know you might not feel comfortable coming, but let me know if I could stop by afterwards and share with you some of the things that we talked about. Be that person who extends that hand. Be that person who may be able to change the inner voice of someone who is struggling with what they hear internally within themselves. But also, don't ever think that because someone on the surface looks unruffled, that they're fine. So often we'll tell people like, oh, you're fine, you're strong, you'll get through this. And maybe externally they look put together, they're functioning, they're coming to events, they've got a smile on their face, but maybe internally they're crumbling and they're cracking. And that can be the most dangerous element when it comes to mental health care, that if we don't see it, we don't know it. But people are struggling, and they're struggling in different ways, and sometimes it's the ones that have the largest smile on their face that are actually experiencing the greatest struggle inside. So trying to be there and recognizing that which we don't see and how it can impact people. So what exactly is anxiety? We often talk about anxiety as, a term like, oh, I feel anxious, I'm so anxious, oh, I think I have anxiety. We self-diagnose. A lot of times, we see a lot of young people going onto WebMD and deciding, well, this is what I have, forget the fact that they have no medical training or, nothing other than Google to look up what they're experiencing. But I'm so depressed, I'm so anxious. It tends to be part of our lexicon now, part of the language that we hear. But anxiety as a clinical disorder is different than anxious episodes or anxiety as a situational response. Anxiety is a clinical or chronic disorder. It's something that is diagnosable, that is consistently within the mind and the body. That is triggered, it could be social anxiety, it could be by surroundings, by people, it could be internal anxiety, it could be triggered by certain thoughts. But clinical or chronic anxiety affects functionality, meaning you're not able to get up in the morning, you're not able to leave your home, you're not able to connect or communicate, you're not able to go to work. It can often be very crippling. And of course, there's different degrees of the clinical and chronic anxiety. It is treatable. It is treatable. And this part is so important because we are a community that is terrified of medications, that we say no anti-anxiety, no antidepressants, medication, I'm going to become dependent on it, I'm going to wind up, becoming an addict. No, just like we take that Tylenol for a headache, right? We take the medication that we need for the physical ailment. There are times where medication is needed for mental health ailments as well. And again, remember that holistic view that we take. It may not be medication alone. Usually it's not medication alone. Usually it's a combination of talk therapy, of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, EMDR, different forms of therapeutic approaches that go hand in hand with medication if needed. Now, there are some forms of anxiety that do not require medication. Those are usually situational anxiety or anxious episodes. We have all experienced anxious episodes in our life. We have all experienced anxious episodes in our life, and they don't have to be very dramatic or very big. Sometimes our anxious episodes can be small, but we experience them. When we're afraid of how we're going to do on a test, and we start to feel our heart beating more quickly, we start to feel our hands shaking, maybe we're sweating a little bit. There are physiological elements in response to that anxious emotion. This is something that can occur. And during those moments, maybe we remind ourselves to breathe through it. Maybe we try to occupy our mind with something else. Maybe we try to distract ourselves. Maybe we talk to someone, but we try to find outlets for those anxious episodes, right? Now, when those anxious episodes become consistent, when our response to the unknown is constant fear, that's when it can become more and more difficult. We often talk about, in the field of our refugee work, we often talk about the insha'Allah effect. And one of the things that a lot of our, non-Muslim, non-culturally competent caseworkers here in the resettlement agencies in the US get very upset about sometimes is when they will put together a program, they'll plan an event, or even, our masjid communities face this, and they'll ask people and they'll say, are you coming? I have to make sure we have enough food, we want to make sure that we sell the tickets, and you get insha'Allah, right? Insha'Allah. And I know growing up, when our kids might tell us, I want to go to Chuck E. Cheese, or, I want to go to the park, and we say insha'Allah, I know my kids used to always be like, insha'Allah yes, or insha'Allah no, because this insha'Allah is very open-ended. And what we see with the insha'Allah effect, it's actually a coping mechanism. So many times when we are going through trauma or difficulty, when we are not sure what the future holds, right? There is a sense of what is known to be uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance is trying to avoid uncertainty at all costs. A coping mechanism when you live in very uncertain circumstances is to become more comfortable and more familiar with uncertainty. So you lower the uncertainty avoidance. And so the element of the insha'Allah effect is meant to guide us towards tawakkul, right? To guide us towards a place where we trust Allah, where we feel this sense of if Allah wills it, it will be good. If Allah wills it, it will happen. If Allah wills it, we will be guided towards doing X, Y, Z. But there's a difference between tawakkul and tawakkul. Tawakkul is a decreased uncertainty avoidance in which we do nothing, we take no action because we think Allah will handle it, Allah will take care of it. This is not what we're guided for. We touched upon this yesterday a little bit. The tawakkul is a sense of having that consistency, that recognition that Allah is the best of all planners, but also asking yourself, what can I do? What should I do? And so, I was mentioning with our caseworkers, many times they'll work with our refugee clients and, they'll get very upset because the clients will not give them a yes or a no, right? They'll have an appointment scheduled for them for the doctor and they'll say, are you going to make it to the doctor? And they'll say, inshallah, right? They'll be like, no, it took me 3 months to get you this appointment. You have to make it. Many times here, again in the US, we tend to have higher uncertainty avoidance. We don't like uncertainty. It can increase our anxious outcomes when we have this fear of uncertainty. The lower the uncertainty avoidance, we can see a decrease in anxious outcomes, but we can also see when there is no uncertainty avoidance at all, the opposite end of the spectrum where we can see depression. We can see a lack of willingness to do anything, a lack of wanting to leave, to take steps to change anything. And so we know in our deen, khayrul umur al-wasat, right? The best of all paths is the middle path. And so finding that middle path between high uncertainty avoidance and low uncertainty avoidance is critical. Now, some of the symptoms that we can see with mental health outcomes can be psychosomatic. Psychosomatic means the physical pain is evident and it's what we're trying to address, but the physical pain is actually being stirred by something emotional, something mental. So for example, I know when my daughter, my youngest, was she was about 5 years old in kindergarten, there was a certain time of the day in school that she would always get a stomach ache. And she would go to the nurse's office and she would say, my stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. The pain was real. She really did have a stomach ache and we took her to doctors and got testing and things like that. But it wasn't until we started to see the pattern of every day at this same time her stomach would hurt that we realized there was an issue in her Islamic studies class where she was being bothered by one of the students in that class. And because she started to develop an anxious response to that situation, her stomach would hurt. This is a psychosomatic symptom where we feel the pain and it really does hurt, but it's not a physical ailment. It's a physical ailment that's an outcome of a mental or emotional response. We have a lot of our refugee clients who after they've resettled, they've passed the first 90 days or 100 days of resettlement here in the US, and then suddenly, we'll get phone calls in the middle of the night saying, I'm having a heart attack. I feel like I'm having a heart attack. My left hand, my left arm, my heart is hurting, I can't breathe. Many times these are panic attacks where the body is almost mimicking the alert of the heart attack because you're not okay. There's something that's happening in the way that you're processing your thoughts, in the way that you're thinking about the present or the future, yarhamukumullah, that worries you, that causes fear, that causes pain, and your body's way of telling you get help is to give those physical indicators. And we may try to treat the physical, but if we're not taking that holistic approach of understanding the mental, then we're missing a very large component of what is happening in terms of the internal and the external elements that are impacting our mind and our body. So how do they differ, a panic attack and an anxiety episode or an anxious episode or an anxiety attack? So anxiety often begins here. It will often begin with our thoughts. And many times anxiety is similar to that duck picture that we saw where we may not be able to physically see the symptoms, but the mind is racing. The mind racing can lead to the heart racing, but usually anxious episodes or anxiety attacks are internal. Panic attacks tend to be external. There tends to be a lot of physical pain and physical manifestation. And in both cases, again, there is treatment. There is immediate ways of using grounding techniques and mindfulness methods that we're going to talk about, inshallah, today, that can help bring a decrease in that excessive cortisol that is being released by the body, the stress hormone that is being released, and increasing the serotonin, which is the calming, quieting hormone that makes us feel better. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, we often talk about these symptoms that we experience and what it is that's going on in our mind, in our bodies, in our hearts, similar to the story of the frog in hot water. It's been said that, scientists conducted an experiment years ago in which they had a pot of water on the stove, and they had a very low flame running on that pot of water, so the water was warm. Right? And they had another pot of water, and it was boiling. And they took a frog and they dropped him in the boiling pot of water, the hot water. As soon as the frog's feet touched the hot water, what do you think he did in the boiling pot? He jumped out. He knew he was in danger. He felt it, he sensed it, he saw it. He knew that this was not where he wanted to be. But then the scientists take the same frog and put him in the warm water. And what do you think the frog did? He enjoyed it. He's like, jibalbat, and he's swimming and splashing and, having fun in the water, right? And he's hanging out in the water. But there's a low flame. And so what happens to the water eventually? It boils. And what happens to the frog? He never jumps out. He stays in that water because he never realizes that he's in danger. And so often with anxiety and depression, we will see this same type of analogy occurring, where it's not immediate. It doesn't happen all at once. You don't just wake up one day and say, oh wow, I'm depressed. You don't wake up one day and say, I must have anxiety. You don't wake up one day and say, I'm struggling with bipolar. It's a slow boil. And so often we don't recognize the harm until we've gotten to that point where it's too hard to jump out because we're so immersed in it. And that's what we want to avoid. That's why these programs, these conversations are so important, so that we can start recognizing and understanding the early signs, the preventative methods, and how do we respond when we do recognize that the water is boiling. So what is depression? We know that there are, again, different types of depression. Just like we said, there's different types of anxiety or anxious responses. There can also be clinical or chronic depression. There can also be situational depression. There can be depression that is impacted by genetics. It can be chemical. There can be a hormonal imbalance. We also see depression as an outcome in terms of response regarding resilience. Remember those differing rates of resilience that we talked about earlier. Depression can also be impacted by the environment, by the surroundings. And, we always have this conversation about nature versus nurture, right? Is it something internally that you're born with, or is it something that happens to you from your surroundings? There's no conclusive answer to that. I think it's a little bit of both. I think each of us has a propensity for responding to the difficulties and the tests that we have, and how we respond can be impacted by the internal and the external. It's impacted by our genetics, by our hormones, by our responses, but it's also impacted by our surroundings, our support, and those that we choose to keep company with. But depression can, of course, impact functionality. It can cause one to have those physiological symptoms that we talked about before, a heaviness, a loss of interest in life and connecting with people and communicating. It can impact our concentration. It can impact our motivation. We can find a lack of enjoyment and a decreased energy in terms of being around others. So depression, again, a lot of times we hear, especially in high schools and middle schools, I'm so depressed, I'm depressed, I'm not going out, right? Just, again, a terminology that is, it's almost we take away from the importance and the serious nature of depression as a diagnosable illness, because we'll use it in that way. And that's not what depression is. Depression is not sadness, it's not grief, it's not sorrow. Depression is heavier than that. It's deeper than that. It impacts functionality. And so, yes, we have all experienced sadness. We have all experienced grief. We have all experienced sorrow. But can we all say that we have been depressed or we are depressed? No. There has to be a recognition and understanding and differentiation of what is depression as opposed to what are emotions that are part of the natural human capacity in terms of responding to situations. Depression can often be more prolonged than sadness, grief. With depression, there is no movement forward. There is often a static kind of station where we're standing still and there isn't a movement forward. Sometimes it can intensify, but rarely does it become decreased. Oftentimes depression will maintain kind of a status. And again, there is no harm in seeking medication. When you are diagnosed with depression, there is no harm in seeking help in the forms of therapy. That is actually what we're meant to do. When our mind and our body is telling us something is wrong, we're meant to listen. And yes, we also make dua, and yes, we also surround ourselves with people, and yes, we go to the masjid, but that may not be the remedy by itself. and we have to look at it as one piece of the puzzle. Oftentimes we'll see with issues of anxiety and issues of depression that people will sometimes look for help, but not always in the right places. We see a lot of young people struggling with mental health outcomes, going to Discord, going to vent, going online, going to Instagram, Snapchat, so many of these things that they can access online right now. Unfortunately, we can sometimes see situations in which that can cause the depression or the anxiety to become worse. We've talked a lot this past year about doom scrolling, where we're just constantly going through our phone, looking at images of what's happening in Gaza, the difficulties that our communities are facing, things that are happening, and that can also cause two different outcomes. It can desensitize the individual to feel like, you know what, everything is terrible anyway, and I'm not going to have any type of response or action. Or it can intensify feelings and emotions of hopelessness, of, feeling like there's nothing good in this dunya, feelings of despair. And so we want to be very conscious of the impact that our devices and surrounding ourselves with the wrong community at the wrong time. We want to ensure that we have healthy outlets and avenues. And alhamdulillah, I know we have different apps now. There's the app called Sakina. Sakina or Sukoon? I always forget which one it is, but look up both. It's either Sukoon or Sakina. And it's similar to the Calm app, or there's another one called Better Health, I think, where it provides avenues of Islamic community where you can connect with people, you can talk about difficulties you may be experiencing. I believe it has an option for connecting with therapists. There's another app called Ruh, R-U-H, out of Malaysia. And there's many groups in Malaysia actually who are doing great things in terms of mental health avenues online that people can access. But Ruh is another great resource that you might want to take a look at. There's a few others as well. Again, if you email our office, they can provide you a list of all of the resources that are currently out there that can actually help when we're going through these difficulties. Unfortunately, we also see negative coping mechanisms come into play. We often see people who are struggling with mental health outcomes turning to things that they think will make them feel better. We know that we have, honestly, and it really is an epidemic of vaping, smoking, weed, among our youth primarily, but we are seeing so many young people, especially since the legalization of weed, turning to weed, having access to it very easily, turning to it as a substance because they will say things like, I can't sleep, I need to focus myself, I have ADD, I have ADHD, and this helps me. But we know, just as any unregulated substance, just as anything that we may ingest that, without the guidance of, a Tylenol, for example, or Advil, or any other type of medication, if we are taking it in an unregulated way, that this will cause harm and it will cause negativity. We also see people turning to other elements, behavioral addictions. One of the behavioral addictions that unfortunately plagues our community is pornography. And again, it's something we don't really talk about, but pornography is prevalent in our communities with males and females. Again, we don't talk about it, but the accessibility of pornography, the fact that we look at pornography impacting the mind and we see actually that the mind responds to pornography in a very similar way as the mind responds to addictive substances like crack and cocaine. And that when there is a usage of pornography that leads to that addictive state, the person who is addicted winds up craving it just as they would crave another substance. And again, I touched upon this yesterday, but I think we need to keep talking about it and understanding what is happening in our communities, that nobody is immune to this addiction. And we see even, unfortunately, with a recent Quran teacher and what has happened in that space, in that situation. There's a wonderful program run by a brother out in California called Purify Your Gaze, and it's an online program. Be familiar with it. Understand how it works. It's a coaching program that helps break the behavioral addiction of pornography. Oftentimes, pornography will be turned to as a negative coping mechanism, but it can also be, it's like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Pornography can also be the instigator of mental health outcomes such as depression, such as anxiety, such as borderline personality disorders, bipolar disorders, we have seen a link between pornography usage and mental health outcomes. And whether it's because someone is turning to it as a behavioral addiction because it's a negative coping mechanism, or it is what instigates the mental health outcome, it does need to be addressed. We also see gaming, excessive usage of trying to dissociate and to enter into another space that takes you out of reality. Again, very prevalent, something that can turn into an addiction. We also see food addictions, we see eating disorders, we see unregulated usage of food as something that is a negative coping mechanism. Again, we look at how our food is killing us, the chemicals that are placed in our food, the hormones, the lack of natural elements in our diet, the lack of balance in our diet, and how it's impacting us. And there is, again, studies that are being conducted. There's one that should come out soon in the Journal of American Psychology on the impact of food and children's outcomes of children's depression and the increase in clinical depression among children. And there is a link between that as well. So being aware that these are negative elements, and again, it's the whole what comes first. Is it the bad food we're eating that's leading to negative mental health outcomes, or is it the negative mental health outcomes that are leading us to eat bad food? They go hand in hand. And it's not about which comes first, it's about how do we address it, how do we approach it. And again, this is another space where counseling can help. Counseling can help identify what is happening internally that's causing the external outcomes. All right, we're just going to get through a couple more slides and then we'll take a 15-minute break and then come back, inshallah. So when we turn to addressing these aspects of mental health outcomes from an Islamic perspective, we begin to recognize that our Quran, that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam guided us through a better understanding of that which we will be tested with and how to respond to these tests. We mentioned that, is it coming back? Hopefully it will, inshallah. We mentioned that depression is not the same as sadness. It's not the same as grief. It's not the same as sorrow, right? And we understand this from the Islamic perspective when we look to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who experienced the whole range of emotions that we as humans experience in this dunya. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced sadness in the form of the absence of something. Sadness often arrives when we are missing something or someone, where there is an absence of that which brings us comfort. And one of the experiences of sadness that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced was when there was an absence or a pause in the revelation. After the first verses of the Quran were revealed, there was a period of time in which the revelation paused, and the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam began to worry, and he felt a heaviness, a sadness, because he missed that connection with Allah Azza wa Jal. And we know that in response to that heaviness, to that sadness, that Allah Azza wa Jal revealed to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in essence to all of us, the verses of Surah Al-Duha. And it's a chapter in the Quran that is meant to uplift us in those moments of sadness. When Allah Azza wa Jal reminds the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, وَالدُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى, that just as there is a night, there is also a dawn. And we often hear that saying, that it gets darkest right before dawn, right when we feel like we're in the most difficult moment of our life. So often, that is when Allah Azza wa Jal brings the faraj, the opening that we've been waiting for. We see Allah Azza wa Jal in this chapter in the Quran reminding the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam of where he was and where he is. أَلَمْ يَجِدْكَ يَتِيمًا فَآوَى, did we not find you as an orphan and give you refuge? Remembering difficulties that we've been through in the past and recognizing the positive place that we're currently in. So when we're struggling, if we're able to think back to a time that was more difficult than what we're in right now, a time where we thought things were not going to get better, and yet they did, because Allah Azza wa Jal promises that they will. These are the moments that can help uplift us and shift that lens of sadness. And the last verse in Surah Al-Duha, where we're reminded, وَأَمَّا بِنَعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ, that we should proclaim with gratitude the blessings of Allah. This is one of the modern psychology concepts, that keeping a gratitude journal, reminding yourself of what is good, being thankful, that practice of thankfulness, of hamd, is actually considered a modern psychology approach to trying to work through emotions and difficulties and struggles. So in the Quran, we're told that we'll experience this sadness, and we're given an approach of how to address that sadness and what we should do when we are in those spaces. We also know that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced grief. Grief often is accompanied by a physical manifestation. So grief is often accompanied by tears. It's accompanied by physical shifts in terms of the facial muscles. One of the studies that we conducted at Cornerstone was on facial cues and non-verbal elements that can help us better understand the emotional state or state of being of individuals.